Well, good afternoon to everyone joining us today for the third in our pre-election learning series, Policy-Wise in Iowa. In the previous 2 weeks, we've talked about policies to strengthen our workforce, including a deeper dive into the challenges facing our childcare system. Today, we pick up a topic that also has links to our workforce, both in the short and the long term, as well as incredibly serious implications for Iowa kids and their families, and that's public education. I'm Ann Disher, and I'm Executive Director of Common Good Iowa. I'm joined today by Mike Owen, Common Good Iowa's Deputy Director, and really our point person on school issues, especially school funding issues. Mike brings a wealth of experience analyzing policy and educating his fellow Iowans on this topic, including time he spent on the West Branch School Board, so he's been in the trenches on this issue. Mike is going to give us an overview of big school issues facing our state and facing the people we elect to represent us in Des Moines. As is our habit here at Common Good Iowa, much of his presentation will focus on school funding, pre-K through higher ed, and the link between great schools and tax policy. Every issue we care about, every issue I think folks on the line care about has a link to tax policy, and schools are certainly no exception. As always, we've reserved time at the end of the session for Q&A. We'll monitor both the chat and the Q&A, so you're welcome to drop your questions or comments in either place, either during Mike's presentation or after. And we want to be respectful of people's times and close in 45 minutes. So Mike, I will go ahead and turn things over to you right now to get going.
Well, thank you very much, Ann. Been looking forward to talking with folks about this issue, as we are most of the year. Education is, as you all know, a very big part of Iowa's budget, but it's also a big part of our culture in Iowa, something we've always been very proud of. And so the emphasis on it, both during the campaign season and during the legislative session, requires some pretty good scrutiny to make sure that we're really all talking about the same things and talking about the values that Iowans place on education. So let's start out with just, this is our perspective. I think it's one that honors a real Iowa value, that education is really the path to opportunity. A state that values advancing opportunity for all its children is one that invests in education, in public education. And that's not just in financially, but it's in words and in deeds. And I think the words are something that we really want to get in here to. We really want to look at what's behind the words of a state that tells its people that it's investing fully in education. So our priorities when we talk about this issue right now are, we need to reinvest in education at all levels. So it's not just preschool through 12, but it's also after high school, and that's, across the board. We're talking about regents, community colleges, other post-secondary education that people need to be able to succeed in the economic world that they are entering when they leave school. To do that, we need to stop funding diversions to private schools. We already do a lot of that in Iowa, as we're going to get into in this session, and there are more proposals on the table, and these are all things that will, despite whatever the politicians want to tell you, these will, in fact, have tremendous impacts on public education, which we view as the primary responsibility of our state. Part of this is valuing educators. And again, we're talking here not just about finances, but how we support them. Educators have come under tremendous attacks in Iowa over the last year or so from various angles. I think we're all familiar with some of those remarks that have been made by certain legislators. And that does not support a strong public education system. If we want to attract our best and brightest people into the teaching profession, we need to show that we value what they're doing, that we honor their commitment to our children. Part of that will be ending what the teacher pay penalty, which we're going to get into in this session, something that's been analyzed by the Economic Policy Institute. And I think you'll find quite interesting if you haven't seen their report yet. And again, giving these professional educators, we're talking about teachers, administrators, support staff, everybody involved with school districts, and beyond K-12 and PK-12, giving those people the respect they deserve, as any of us would expect in the jobs we hold. So start out by when we talk about reinvesting in education, that implies one thing: we haven't been investing in it properly. We haven't been investing in education the way we have historically expected, what has been the tradition in Iowa. We have held down public school funding for over a decade in this state. So don't be fooled. You will hear politicians using very big numbers. This is inevitable in something that is over half of an $8 billion budget is education. So they'll talk about record spending levels. Well, of course, if you spend just $1 more, it's a new record, but that doesn't mean it's actually paying the bills. It doesn't mean that you're keeping up with the costs that you face in putting a school budget together. There is a shell game of state versus local dollars when legislators sometimes talk about this issue. They'll talk about increases in state funding, but what they're not talking about is that a lot of times those increases in state funding come with reductions in local funding. And so these are not necessarily things that actually give school districts more resources to work with. It's just a shift in how those dollars are provided. That's why when we talk about this, we don't deal a lot with those big, millions of dollar numbers, because the key element is something called supplemental state aid, which for many years we knew as something called allowable growth. And as we're going to illustrate here, it's a percentage that has an impact on the per pupil, the basic building block of a state budget or of a school budget. That the budget is built from a per pupil cost, and that is permitted to increase by a certain amount every year. That is supplemental state aid. And that's what the legislature sets, and that governs both local and state funding. Now, another piece of that is the budget is based on enrollment. So if you're in a declining enrollment school district, you may not be getting you're not going to get the kinds of increases that districts that are increasing in funding are getting, or increasing in enrollment. They're going to get a larger percentage adjustment in their budget. And what's more is it's going to carry state dollars. If you're in a declining school district, you can keep up for a year with a little bump, but even that little bump is caused by property tax increases. That's also something that legislators don't like to talk about very much. So let's talk about how, very briefly, how supplemental state aid works. So you start with this per pupil cost, and last year it was $7,227 per pupil. The legislature set SSA percentage at 2.5%. That raised the per pupil cost to $7,413 per pupil. So all state school districts, all local school districts in the state are subject to that limitation on their regular budget setting. And there are adjustments that are made to that. But again, this is the key feature of school budgets. So you get that cost, and the formula that is in place then sets the amount that will come from local property tax and the state general fund. And this is how that works. So you see that box, it represents the per pupil cost. You set a what's called the foundation level. You determine what is that percentage. It's about 88% now of the budget. And this is this is how the formula works. So you figure out where that line is. And then the first thing you do is you levy property tax. And that's $5.40. And so that will generate a different amount depending on the property values in your school district. So if you're in a higher property value school district, that $5.40 is going to raise a larger sum or a larger share of that 88% foundation of your per pupil cost. That is then augmented by state aid. So those are the state dollars that come in to take you up to that 88% mark. Then you levy more property tax. And on top of that is another little sliver for state aid, and that represents the increase that's caused by the supplemental state aid increase for that year. So that 2.5 for this year, for example, would be that little slender line across the top. That is the basic building block of a local school budget. So what's been happening with that through the years? It's been very shaky over over a decade. You can see that from about 2006 through 2010, it was up around 4%, and then it's been up and down since then. There was the Great Recession came a little over a decade ago. That affected school budget setting. But the main thrust of all this, the main point of this graph is shown really in this very simple two bars. From 2002 through 11, the average growth, the average supplemental state aid number was over 3%. For the last 12 years, it's been under 2%. Now, when you go over that amount of time, you can see that kind of an average increase is not going to let you keep up with costs, because costs have been higher than that, and certainly in the last year they've been even more so. But we set this year at 2.5%, and as you know, the inflation has run 7 or 8% over this last year. So we have some recommendations. These are not going to be necessarily too concrete, because really in many ways we want to defer to allies that we have in the education community. I think over the next 2-3 months, they'll be coming up, if they haven't already, they'll be coming up with their own proposals. But I think that there is a common theme here.
And it looks like Mike, I'll tell you what, we are on a real road of, okay,
What happened? Sorry.
you're back. Thank goodness.
Did
I'm
I
gonna
lose
let
you?
you relaunch.
Did I lose my,
Yep, I think you'll need to reshare.
okay, well, we will do that.
Hey.
That's odd. I beg your pardon. This is, I don't know why that happened. We may have to see if Ann can open this up and Let's see, I'll try it one more time here. Can you see that? Are we screen sharing?
I do not see your screen, Mike. I'm happy to go ahead and pull up slides. You'll just have to direct me. This is becoming a habit for those of you who were on our conversation
Wait,
last week
here's
around.
okay. Let's see if this works.
Hey, I think it's going to work.
Okay. So we were talking about supplemental state aid and getting that to a meaningful level that conceivably could be for a number of years. If we did that, that's really making the commitment to public schools that is the political talk. We always want to talk about education being the priority. Well, is it the priority? So that's what this next proposal suggests, and this is something we came up with. We believe that all of these scheduled tax cuts that are coming in the latest legislation should be tied to supplemental state aid, to a multi-year commitment on supplemental state aid, so that our public schools have the resources they need. And if for some reason that we see these tax cuts that are coming, which are going to be in about 3-4 years, about $2 billion out of what is now an $8 billion budget. That's just a huge amount of money. There's no way for that unchecked. There's no way for that not to affect education and really any service that we're talking about in the state. But education being over half the budget is going to be a big impact. So if education is really our priority, this would put some meaning behind that rhetoric. You would say that we're going to make sure that supplemental state aid is funded. And if it can't be with the revenues that are coming in after these tax cuts that are coming in, we claw back some of those tax cuts to make sure supplemental state aid is funded. On there, our students first. We hear students first a lot. Are students first or are tax cuts first? Let's be honest with people about this. One other big part of this is stopping the diversion of funds to private schools. So again, you'll hear the political rhetoric, but the math is very clear that every dollar spent in private schools from taxpayer money shortchanges Iowa public schools and really or other public services that are dependent on state funding, because that is a budget choice that's being made. The biggest challenge is the one the governor has been pushing for the last couple of years for a voucher program, which would provide sizable subsidies for students attending private, often religious schools in the state. Her last plan was last session was going to be for a cost of $55 million covering 10,000 students. Understand that is the entryway into this program. The goal of folks who want this program, these vouchers, are for a far greater use of it than $55 million. Not that $55 million is a small amount of money. $55 million is more than 1% supplemental state aid for schools. So again, what's going to be the impact on supplemental state aid if you put in these voucher programs? Other problems with these voucher programs is there are many approaches, and so the devil will be in the details as to what actually passes. But some of these programs could subsidize students that are already going to private schools and don't need an extra subsidy. It could be used, as some of these proposals had, to pad college savings accounts for the people that are going to private schools. There is no similar subsidy for those kinds of savings for students in public schools. Why would we do that? And this is probably the key point, is that none of these proposals have offered sufficient accountability with tax money. As Ann mentioned, I was on a school board for 11 years. And I know that we had to go to great lengths to document how taxpayer money was spent, even publishing a lot of information in newspapers about it. These all had to be public records. We don't get that kind of accountability with private schools. So that has to be part of any plan, really should be part of any plan for the use of public money. And so why should private schools have an exemption there? The other angle on this is that they use the word choice. I don't like to use it very often, but I'm using it here just to say that it was never an issue. And I think many of our colleagues from education organizations have made these points very well, that we already have many ways that people can choose to have their children educated. There's open enrollment, there's homeschooling, we have charter schools, and we have, in fact, one of the most recent ones is the charter schools that can be set up as public charter schools, not subject to local control. Then there's a big tax credit issue that we have looked at through the years is the school tuition organization tax credit, which goes hand in hand as well with the tuition and textbook tax credit. Both of these are, again, expensive. They could be worse, but they have grown. And we're going to talk here about the STO, or school tuition organization tax credit. That's a credit that is provided for scholarship programs run by these school tuition organizations. It started back in 2006, and it had bipartisan approval, as you can see here. It's been expanded. It was signed by Governor Vilsack, and it's been expanded by succeeding governors. Even though in 2010, fairly early in its use, there was a special tax credit review panel that was formed after the scandal in the film credit program, and it reviewed tax credits across the board. And in this case, it recommended scaling it down from what it was at that point. Instead, this is what has happened is it's expanded. So you can see where we stood back in 2010 when that committee came up with its recommendations. It has only expanded since then. So on this, we say lawmakers should block any school voucher program. We should require local approval of charter schools so that there's local control over the use of those tax dollars in their communities and competing with the regular public schools. And again, assure transparency of private school budgets that use tax dollars. In terms of valuing educators, we wanted to, it's about paying them right. It's about respecting their skills. And there's something that I mentioned at the start of the program about the teacher pay penalty. This is something from an Economic Policy Institute report. There are 21 states where the penalty is over 20%. And that means that that teachers in those states are paid less than 80 cents on the dollar compared to similarly educated, college-educated workers in other fields. What that means is that teachers have choices with the education that they have. And we want to do things that attract teachers to the profession. Pay is going to be one of those elements. Certainly not calling them names would help as well. But in Iowa, the penalty isn't above that 20%. It's closer to 15%. And in neighboring states, it ranges from 18 to 24%. So how are we going to change that with SSA being what it is? And how are we going to change that with these tax cuts that are coming? So we say that legislators should eliminate the teacher pay penalty. They should commit to a long-term strategy to raise teacher pay And they should restore collective bargaining rights, which if you were on our first one of these programs 2 weeks ago, Sean Finn talked about that issue, and that information about that that piece of the puzzle is on our website on the PolicyWise page and under Sean's program. Another thing we wanted to mention was about higher education. You see this a lot in the rhetoric, you see it on social media a lot. People pit 4-year education versus 2-year education or against other post-secondary education. You know, people use bridges that are designed by people with one kind of education and built with people with another kind of education. All of these things are part of our society and part of our economy, and it doesn't serve the education being a value of ours to pit one form of education against another. Different people need different kinds of education for the kinds of skills that they want to do. And all boats are lifted with investments in higher education. That is why we have a role with public funding to make sure people have access to higher education. So let's look what the trends have been. This is, you can see where Iowa ranks very low in over about a 5-year period there, 2016 to 2021, in its percentage change in support for higher education, state support. You shouldn't take that number in a vacuum because there's an impact on that. If you're shrinking your state investment in higher education, what happens? You're shifting costs to parents and students because your tuition and fees are going to go up. This is a 20-year graph. It's actually a couple of years old from Legislative Services Agency. It is not adjusted for inflation, but it really shows that just in the dollar terms we have, that state funding has actually gone down over that period from what it was back in the start of this century, in that 20 years. Meanwhile, tuition and fees have steadily increased. So what should we do? We need to boost state support. Again, across the board, to the Regents institutions, to community colleges, to other vocational and post-secondary programs, and to private colleges. There are students that attend the private colleges in the state that are part of this puzzle as well, and have been traditionally. So these are commitments that we made in the past that we are not making anymore. I would mention that the private education thing is different from K-12. You know, you might have some gotcha people out there. You're saying you support private education here. It's been part of the mix in higher education. It has not been part of the mix in public funding for K-12, and to institute it at this time detracts from public education. So that's a summary. I apologize for the interruption. I must have hit a button wrong or something to interrupt that presentation. I hope that you'll think about some of these things we talked about here today, and if you want to help us spread the word about them, here's some ways you can do it. If you want to contribute to our work, you know, $22 will help us do some promotion online. $125 will help us get to your community to make a presentation where hopefully I would not screw up the PowerPoint. I'm going to turn it over to Ann.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate your data and smart thinking around these issues. We'll open it up here for Q&A in a moment. Before we do that, I do want to remind folks that this is the third of a 6-part series, giving folks some good facts and policy proposals in advance of the November elections. And we'll be back here next Wednesday at the same time, same place. And we'll be talking about policies to support Iowa's health and well-being. So if you're a Medicaid, if you love Medicaid, as some of us on the call do, please do join us. And then the weeks after that one we'll be talking about gaps in our economy and supports for Iowans in times of need. And then we'll end up really trying to link a lot of threads back to tax policy, examining taxes, and I think in all of these, in the first 5 pieces of this webinar, we're really talking about in all cases these policies that are really important to Iowans and their links to having a budget to support them. And the other piece, of course, of a tax system is that we are taxing folks in a way that is fair and equitable. And so we're really focused on the kind of tax incidence side. And then I do want to give a quick shout out. I'm going to share my screen quick if I can. My God, technology. Okay, so you should see my screen here, and I just want to do a shout out, except for you're not going to see my screen because of all my notes. Chaos here, folks. But I did just want to point out where you can find all the resources from our presentation and from all of the presentations we're going to be doing. So you're looking here at our website, www.commongoodiowa.org, and you really can't miss the tilted capital with the orange background. I'm sure that's not apocalyptic at all. And you can see here, it'll take you to the link inside of our webpage where we have the fact sheets, the slides, and the webinar recordings from all the sessions we've done to date. We'll be posting each week the materials. We should have the fact sheet really that outlines Mike's presentation today is already online. It's a great summary of what we've talked about. We hope that if you all are out talking to lawmakers, if you are an elected official or a candidate for office, that you can use some of these facts and these materials on this fact sheet. So again, you'll find it on our website, website right there. And I will again would love to take some do some Q&A. And I will say we have a comment from Charlie Bruner, former CFPC executive director. And it's a longer comment. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to try to summarize here. That he notes the governor's not only proposed diverting state funds for education to non-public schools, but also implying that parents believe public education is indoctrinating children and are against public schools. And this is not a majority view of parents. How is Common Good Iowa going to raise the foundational role that public education plays? And that includes supporting all parents, respecting diversity, supporting science, and so forth. And I feel like that is not, that is a Common Good Iowa job. That is a job, I think, of all of us on the line. And I mean, that just is a really foundational question. And if we're going to make the link here that a lot of the issues we're talking about are linked to tax policy, I think they're also really linked to transparency, openness, and voting rights. And making sure that folks are able to understand what elected officials are doing and that they can really have a voice in our policies. Because I think the point that is not a majority view is correct. And as with other forms of government, we have folks in elected office who are promoting policies that are not supported by the majority of people. And so, again, just as taxes are really integral to everything we talk about, I do think that issue around transparency, openness, and voting rights is going to be an important piece of it. But I would love to, I'm looking at Mike, and if you've got thoughts about that, I would welcome them as well.
Charlie raises some real fundamental questions here. And I think that we are going to continue to talk about this foundational role that you talk about here, Charlie. And I know that education advocates are doing that, but we need people, we think it's important to remind people of our traditional value in Iowa about education. I agree with Charlie that what's being said about public education is not a majority view. It's just very vocal, and they have some people in places that can extend that argument a lot further because of their place in the power structure. But I don't believe it's a majority role, majority view. I believe Iowans do support critical thinking skills, and that knowing your history and knowing science is something that benefits all of us. It's a real dangerous area that we're going into here, and we need to respect the people who are who know who've been educated to educate other people. And we should expect more of our political leadership in this area. This is, public education is about also educating the public, and they shouldn't be pandering to these wild notions that we're hearing these days that actually pit people in our society against others. Teachers, we want to draw teachers into the profession, and finances will play a role, but we all know teachers haven't been paid as well as a lot of people for a long time. A lot of them do it because of their commitment to achievement for kids, and they come to it with great passion, and that should be rewarded. And they shouldn't have to worry about people with the torches and pitchforks showing up at school board meetings complaining about what they're teaching, or complaining about Catcher in the Rye being in the library when maybe those people with the pitchforks haven't even read Catcher in the Rye. So kind of a windy answer, but it's something that I feel strongly about as well.
Thanks. We had another comment in the Q&A, and it was a comment, and it refers to a story that I think was originally in the New York Times, and then I think Brenda Loop had a link to the story about it on an NPR station. It was a story about Hasidic schools in New York City that receive in sort of complicated ways lots of public dollars for schools, and that there's really ample evidence that on standardized tests that show that the kids are just not getting even a basic kind of education, at least in English and math, because these are schools, I think, where they're spending most of their time on religious education. And her comment was that any school that made her think of the school voucher program being proposed in Iowa. She said any school educating Iowa's children needs to meet the same standards of education. And I think you're probably not the only one who made that connection, Brenda. I'm going to ask you, Mike, to just reiterate the effects of the income tax cuts that were passed in the last legislative session, and really just the scope of those cuts and what that means for the state budget. I know you alluded to it, but I just think it's a really important conversation, and I just want to make sure everyone leaves really clear about what that's going to mean.
Sure. Okay, so the people aren't going to realize the magnitude of these tax cuts that have just been passed when they go to the polls over the next 2 months. These tax cuts that have been passed will be phased in over 4 or 5 years to a level of about $2 billion in lost revenue. The changes from a tax equity standpoint are not good. They mainly benefit higher income people who already had great advantages in our tax system. But aside from that, just from a revenue standpoint, they are going to be devastating for any services that are supported by or fundamentally dependent on state dollars from our general fund. So the general fund currently, or a state budget, is about $8.2 billion. And what we're talking right now, and what we're talking about is taking almost a quarter of that away in just a matter of a few years. And we're not talking about anything that's going to fill those gaps. So inevitably, services will be affected. Now, our general fund is over half devoted currently to education. Now, that's education at all levels. But the preschool to 12th grade share of that is the biggest part of our education funding by far. So there is no way for education not to be harmed by these tax cuts that are going to be phased in. That's why we had this idea that we threw out there of tying, putting some triggers into those tax cuts that are already on the books, putting some restrictions in there, that some of these tax cuts only go ahead if you're guaranteeing a certain amount of supplemental state aid for schools. That's just one idea of how to connect the service to the revenues, which we think is always important. We don't talk about taxes in a vacuum. We think as people need to understand that schools are a service that requires funding, and so tax policy has an impact on it, just as we have that same situation for anything, whether it's law enforcement or healthcare or childcare or environmental quality. All these things cost money, and all will be affected by these tax cuts that are on the books. And Ann mentioned our 6-part series. The last part of that series is going to be on taxes, and so we'll go into a little more detail on the new tax bill that just passed. But again, you're going to go to the polls not realizing what those impacts are going to be. In many cases, if people aren't paying attention now to those future impacts, it's going to hit them like a ton of bricks in just a few years. And we're going to wonder what happened.
Thanks, Mike. And I'll just note that figure, that $1.8 billion figure for the cost of those tax cuts, that comes from the Legislative Services Agency. That comes from the group that does analysis for the legislature. So it is as best of an estimate as there is. And I feel like we're just going to be, come and go. I was just going to be tax scolds, and I probably have always been tax scolds. But it's just hard to understate the damage that is gonna befall education and every other service that I think a lot of Iowans care about and that hold up Iowa communities because of that tax cut. All right, we are almost out of time, Mike. I'm going to turn it back to you for just one final thought, and then we'll break.
Well, I'll go back to sharing my screen for just a moment, I think. So we leave you with a quote from somebody we might not always think of as the first person when we talk about education, but Ulysses S. Grant, who mentioned that the free school is the promoter of that intelligence which is to preserve us as a free nation. But I didn't only want to leave you with that quote. So for the West Wing fans on the webinar today, we have this, I think, if I can get it to move, from Sam Seaborn, who said that education is everything. Competition for the best teachers should be fierce. They should be getting 6-figure salaries. Schools should be incredibly expensive for government and absolutely free of charge for its citizens, just like national defense. So it's another way of saying what Ulysses S. Grant said about the importance of the free school promoting intelligence and preserving us as a free nation. It might not be the best framing that you want to use when you're talking about these things, but it is factual. Providing public education is expensive, and we have to pay the bill if we're going to prepare our state and our society and our young people for the future.
Thanks so much, Mike, and thanks everyone for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you in some of the upcoming weeks.